pick the day's top 10 most fascinating news stories. Then I write blurbs from my own perspective or to describe what the stories are about, link off to the sources for the full story. So you can sort of think of it like a modern day column. If the column form were invented, they would probably look a lot like that. Here's what's happening in the world, and here's links off to the full sources for more information.
Okay, so I want to cover two major topics in this talk. One is the shift to how journalism now and news is ubiquitous in the sense where it used to be newspapers and a few TV channels, and now it's everywhere. Facebook feeds, blogs, BuzzFeed, Times Online, and also the shifting standards of news. So how do you think technology is changing the way that we take news in and shifting through what's out there and what can be thought as not fake news?
Well, I think for one thing, it's coming at us so fast now, especially the big shift in the last 6 months to 12 months, I would say, is that news organizations are using notifications a lot more aggressively, and not only using notifications to get you to click on their app, but actually notifications that have the content of the story in them. That's a big push that Apple made in the last 6-8 months. And what that does is it's constantly buzzing. While we're sitting here, we might get a few buzzes. People sitting there might get a few buzzes of news from around the world. And somebody on Twitter the other day called it President PTSD, President Trump stress disorder. There's so much news coming so fast, and we have an administration that is using that to their advantage. So in some ways, it can deaden people's interest in topics. It can confuse people and make them not sure what to believe. And it can also distract them, honestly, from their real lives. I mean, I'm a proponent of news. I think it's more important today than it was yesterday, and certainly than it was a week ago. But we have to remember the first goal of any news organization is to convince you that news is important and something that you can consume. And the truth is, if you're an ordinary person, there are a lot of news that you must consume to be a well-informed republic, but you don't need to keep up with every minute of every detail. So I always tell people to turn the notifications off and remember to live your life and not let it completely distract you from important things.
So how do you feel about bias in news now? And do you feel that it's burying people in leftist or rightist bubbles?
Well, there's sort of a few layers of that. On the one hand, you have the sort of the fake news that everybody talks about and that President Trump has now adopted and accused real news of being fake news. I think fake news has to be separated into two pretty big buckets. There's one fake news, like the stories that aren't quite true. They could be true, but they're not quite true, and you see them on Facebook. But I think you have to remember, yesterday my wife and kids and me went to a bar mitzvah. I screamed at my kid for half an hour to try to get their nice clothes on. I screamed at my daughter to wear the right shoes. They told me I was an idiot. We fought in the car all the way to the bar mitzvah. If you look at our pictures on Facebook, we look just as happy as all of your families. So everything on Facebook is fake news. We have to start from that. Everything you see on Facebook, from your happy trip to the bar mitzvah yesterday to what Trump is pushing, there's something much more nefarious that goes on with true fake news, which is there's a company called Cambridge Analytica that was a software company that was used by both the Leave Brexit supporters and Trump campaign. And what Cambridge Analytica does basically is they go into your Facebook accounts and they use publicly available data. They find out things about you, and then they find out at what moment you'd be most susceptible to news. And that news is actually not intended to motivate you. The most effective news is intended to suppress votes. So they'll find somebody who's sort of a lukewarm Democrat who's not that big a fan of Hillary but doesn't want Trump to win, and they'll put up a thing that says, hey, you can vote right now. Click. Save your trip to the poll. Click right here. Do you want to vote for Hillary or Donald? And you click Hillary. It says, thanks, your vote has been counted. You've done your patriotic duty. Now, out of 100,000 people, 99,500 people know that's fake. They didn't really just vote. But you do that to a few million people, 10,000 people believe it happened, you win an election in a district by 10,000 people. It works pretty effectively. So there's fake news and then there's specific voter suppression. One is a big problem. One is like a deadly problem.
So do you think Facebook they're starting to out their monitoring function of what is fake news? Do you think they could be doing more in that sense?
Well, some of it can be viewed as sort of the spam problem. You know, about 15 years ago, email the so-called killer app, and I think it is. I communicate my newsletter via email. But about 15 years ago, it was almost impossible for newsletter writers to get news to people's inbox because the spam problem was so bad, and people were shifting off of email. You saw the rise of other forms of communication. Well, tech companies came in and they solved the spam problem. It's really not an issue anymore. So it is possible to use technology and tech companies that care about this stuff to make a difference. It's not the only answer, though. The bigger answer, I mean, there's fake news, but there's also biased news. So, and a lot of that bias is not, I'm not talking about Breitbart where you can see, hey, they're rooting for this guy, or, you know, and the same on Daily Kos or Talking Points Memo, they're rooting for the other guy. I'm talking about a bias that exists mostly in not just how things are covered, but what's covered. On the day of the Women's March last week, when there were 3.5 million to 5 million, or by Trump numbers, like 300 million people marching, it was the front page of every major newspaper, as it should have been. 1 in 5 newspapers did not cover that march on their front page. Fox News had one tiny link at the very bottom of their site. So what's happening is that there's these echo chambers that are so incredibly strong that people who you think would be going, oh my God, how did we elect this guy? Look at all these people voting against him. Or even if you're a Trump supporter, the other side of the equation. You know, Friday there was a big women's an anti-choice march on Washington, people who are against abortion. The Washington Post had it on the front of the front cover. The New York Times had it on the front page. Of course, Fox did. But when it's the other side, you see sites like Fox and their followers and their smaller publications don't even cover the news, so that's really big. And one other issue that people don't think about that much is the timing of news. If you look back, October 7th may have been the most important day of this campaign. October 7th, 2 stories broke, and I want you guys to think about which story stood out more in your mind. 2 stories, one was huge, sort of in the ethics and gossip area. One was huge in terms of the geopolitical area. One story that came out was a story about Donald Trump getting caught on tape with Billy Bush saying that he grabbed a woman's private parts. On October 7th, David Sanger in the New York Times wrote the first in-depth story about how Russia tried to influence our election through the hacking, and that they may have done it specifically for one candidate. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks post-election, that's become maybe the biggest story in the world. But the day that it came out, when it really could have made a difference, it came out on the exact same day as the grabbing story came out. So if you look back in this close to an election, you can easily make the argument that actually that story about Trump and Billy Bush on the bus in '95 actually won him the election. It didn't lose him the election, but it may very well have won it for him because the other story that was so huge got suppressed and pushed to the background. And that's not just the fault of media. That's the fault of media consumers. That's the fault of politicians. That's the fault of all of us.
So for those who are looking to break out of the echo chambers and see different real opinions from other sides or other perspectives, what are some sources or ways to discover journalism and news that could be beneficial? Yeah,
I think, you know, it's good to read the news that comes from the other side or perspectives you don't agree with, because it's good to try to understand people. When it comes to stuff where you have fact-based news and you have complete lies and made-up material, those are not equivalents. There's the attempt being made today to have a false equivalence between those two things and make people feel like, hey, you should really listen to the other side, even though that other side is spouting alternative facts, quote unquote. And I don't think that's actually healthy, but it's important to separate the stories from the people. Ultimately, the only way fake news about a group can work is if those groups are separated. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. And at the beginning of Hitler's rise, and I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler right now or doing anything, I'm talking about propaganda and news only. At the beginning of Hitler's rise, Goebbels had a big challenge to make everybody believe that the Jews were to blame for every problem in Germany and around Europe, right? So they had a list of stereotypes and caricatures they wanted to make of Jews. Well, it was a lot harder to spread that message in the early 30s because you'd read the news and you'd go, but I'm reading what they're saying about Jewish people, but my neighbor Doug is Jewish, and he doesn't seem like that. He seems like a pretty cool guy, and he babysits my kids, and this is not true. So that's when they came up with the idea, hey, let's create these ghettos. Let's create the Warsaw Ghetto and ghettos in Germany, and let's move the Jews to a place where they can't interact with the rest of the public. Now start spreading your message that Jews are bad, Jews are to blame for all this. That message is much more ingestible because you don't have anything to compare it to. So now let's look at today's America. We have absolutely no geographic interaction between segregated communities of Trump voters in red states and red counties and liberal America that lives in coastal elite or however you want to do it. Because of that, there's been these stereotypes created on both sides. People in Trump country think that people who live out here in San Francisco are coastal elites. We don't care about their jobs. We don't care if technology is eating up their employment. We don't hear their problems. We don't care about anything they say. Our movies and television shows depict them all like you see the characters in Fargo. They're all something to laugh at. They're a big joke. We don't respect what they've done. We love the fact that we're having a move towards renewable energy, which is great, but on the other hand, we don't ever step back and say, hey, but thanks for digging the coal for the last 200 years and powering our country and risking your life. That was actually a noble thing to do. You're not bad, you're good, and we're gonna bring you up, right? So that's their perspective of us. We have a perspective of them that's based on these sort of caricatures of people driving around with guns in the back of pickups. So we're afraid to communicate with them, and we build up a hate. They build up a hate towards us. Now we're in this beautiful situation where if you want to create caricatures and create hate and division between people, you can do it. So ultimately, the only way to truly stop fake news, the most dangerous fake news, is that people themselves actually interact, because you can't lie about me if I'm sitting right in front of you.
So what can journalism do to help break down that dichotomy?
I mean, I'm a fan of mainstream journalism. I'm not going to sit here and buy into the idea that Breitbart is one version of truth and New York Times is the other. It's not true. The New York Times is doing a great job of covering this right now. The Washington Post is doing an excellent job of covering the administration right now. The media actually does cover, there's a big myth. I go to 75 to 100 websites every day, news sites. And during the election and post-election analysis, there was this idea that people in the Rust Belt and coal country were being ignored by the media. It's not true. They may have been ignored too much by the Democratic Party, but they were not being ignored by the media. The opiate crisis, the crisis in coal country, the crisis in fracking company have been on the economic divide have been on the front of the New York Times every 3 days for the last 2 years. So one of the big areas of division we have to be cognizant of is the war on media and the attempts by like Steve Bannon and others to say, the media is the opposition party. One of the things you have to remember is that when you talk about working class America, journalists are working class America, and their industry is under just as much threat as people who are digging coal or mining coal. So dividing those two working class groups, the people who are the truth tellers and the Fourth Estate, and the people who are angry about losing their jobs, is also another good strategy. So I think it's good to get a well-rounded view. It's good to read Fox News. It's good to go to Breitbart so you know what the message the other side is being given, but don't believe the false equivalency. They are not equivalent news sources. The New York Times and Washington Post are giving every chance for truth to come out. And the biggest thing to happen, when I said the future of news might change really quickly, is on, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, Trump was talking about the voter fraud issue. And for the first time, the New York Times called it a lie in a headline. Before it was always falsehoods or untruths or not quite right. That was a big moment in journalism. And when Bannon says that the media is the opposition party, he's totally right. The media should be the opposition if untruths are being spouted. They should be opposed to lies. That's what we have them for. They're our layer of protection. They're the fourth sort of segment of government, and we need them to protect us. So you can also read Next Draft. I link to a lot, exclusively real news. That's why I have a shirt that says Read Real News. But I also do certainly link to the other perspective. I don't link to only one political view, but I do only link to one version of reality, which is the truth.
So shifting now more towards the technological component and innovation, what do you see as the future of journalism when it comes to dissemination? Is it text message? Is it through your newsfeed? Is it bots, AI?
Yeah. Interestingly, I think what a lot of news organizations are figuring out right now is that you are going to get more through bots. You are going to get, I don't think algorithmic news is going to ever take off. They've been trying that for years, sort of algorithms picking your news based on what you like. That's sort of the worst kind of news. On Amazon, it's great to say, hey, you like these kind of products, you might like these kind. News, you need the opposite. You don't want news like what you always read, right? You want news that you may have never thought about. That's the point. I'm not just talking politically, just interest-wise. So human curated news is definitely going to take over and will always beat out algorithmically created news, for sure. You will see some new things with the notifications I talked about. A lot of these things will be negative because it will keep pounding you, and you're going to go crazy. But I think the biggest rise you're going to see in the next year or two is actually going to be news delivered by email. If you talk to any people who run e-commerce sites, their two biggest sources of traffic and purchases come from Facebook and email. Nothing else even comes close. And I think with news, you're going to see the same thing. News organizations are going to try to package their Facebook news better so that it rises and trends, but they're also going to try to target your inbox so they have a more deep relationship with you. And that relationship between news organization and consumer is going to be something you're going to be hearing from publishers and reading about a lot in the next, I'd say, 2 to 5 months. It's going to be a big deal. It's about trust and building a trusted relationship. And being in somebody's personal inbox is actually a very sacred area for people. It's much more trusted area for people. You're in there with the email from my mom, so it's a different relationship. And I think you're going to see more personalization and more emails. I know that doesn't sound too techy, but that is where it's headed, I think.
So we have time for one more question now. If you were to summarize, how would you say the future of journalism looks years down the line?
Sure. Right now, if I had to summarize, I'd say that because of what we've seen in the last week in particular, and the description of the news as an opposition party, and the efforts to ban Muslims that we saw yesterday, and the news exploding, and people protesting, and the ACLU coming in, what you're going to see is that every reporter in America is going to be a war reporter. Every reporter is a war reporter, and the war they're fighting is the war for the truth and for their existence as a valuable part of American society, because they are under threat. The other side is fighting a war against them. They have to now fight the war back. And that doesn't mean getting hysterical. That means more truth, more working together, more determination, putting more money into investigative journalism. And one of the key things that I hope we see, during Trump's first press conference, Jim Acosta from CNN asked a question and Trump shouted him down saying, no, you're fake news, even though the story in CNN was totally true. He was talking about BuzzFeed, and that was also, not true, but it was put out there as a possibility. But when Jim Acosta got shouted down in the press room, the White House press room, they just moved on to the next question, and every reporter asked their questions. That's what has to stop. Every single reporter should have said, sorry, Mr. President, we'll ask our question after Jim Acosta from CNN gets his question. Sort of like, no, I'm Spartacus. Well, every journalist has to be Spartacus now, because it is on, and their industry is in deep, deep danger.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for being here.